If you're in the market for one watch to do everything in, the ultimate everyday tool watch, there is only one that comes to mind, and it's the Rolex Submariner. In this video, we're going to have a look at three of the most important references from the history of Rolex's Submariner and look at the detail which makes a big difference when it comes to buying and wearing the Submariner. So what we'll do is we'll break it down and we'll have a look at a vintage reference versus a limited edition reference versus a more modern reference. And we're going to have a look at the details that separate each of them from each other. And at the same time, we'll consider the type of watch that might be best suited to each of our individual needs. So the very first Rolex launch was the reference 6204 in 1953. It was the quintessential dive watch with rotating bezel for dive time, a painted dial with heavily loomed hands and markers, so visibility was an option underwater, and a 37mm waterproofed oyster case. The Submariner was famously worn by Sean Connery in his first 4 installments as Bond, and in Goldfinger as 6538 reference. So up until the 1680, the reference we have here, all Submariners had no date. And as a result, this was a landmark reference. So in classic Rolex fashion, we've seen the slow evolution of the model. So from the 6204 back in 53, we've seen an increase in case size from 37 to 40mm here. We've got the box plexiglass, which we saw on the earlier references like this. We've seen the inclusion of the date window and an improvement on the depth rating now at 200 meters. One of the key elements of the design process within the Submariner has been the introduction of the screw down crown to ensure that water doesn't get into the watch while diving. This 1680 reference still has a tritium dial, which has that beautiful painted creamy patina, which we love from vintage subs. We know that Rolex actually discontinued the use of tritium in 1998. And we've got all of the DNA which we now know and love from the modern day Submariner. So as we move on from the tritium dials of some of the earlier references of Submariner, we now have the 16610 reference, which was one of the first to sport a luminova dial. The 16610 was produced from 1987 to 2010. We see the depth rating increase from 200 meters to 300 meters. And we also have the introduction of the unidirectional bezel for the very first time. We also have the introduction of sapphire crystal versus the plexiglass that we saw in the earlier references. And we still have the pointed crown guards to protect the crown. But everything else that we know and love from the earlier references of Submariner is still alive and present. One of the critical evolutions in the design process for Rolex and the Submariner was that in 2008, we actually saw the introduction of the GMT Master 2 case in the family line. What's particularly interesting is that that only applied to the date variation of Submariner, not the non-date variation. It was only in 2012 that we saw the non-date Submariner adopt that same GMT Master 2 case. 2003 was the 50th anniversary of the Submariner, and to mark the occasion, Rolex launched the 16610 LV, for the first time ever incorporating a green bezel onto this dive watch. One of the key developments from a design perspective from Rolex that's present in this Kermit 16610 LV is the presence of a so-called maxi dial, which effectively sees the markers blown up with increased luminosity and increased visibility. The other thing to say, of course, about the 16610 LV is that while it was launched in 2003, it was discontinued in 2009. As a result, we know that this is a very late issue model because the Rolex engraving on the Rehort was only present from 2008. In this instance, you can actually see the reference number engraved on the Rehort, which does mean that you don't have to disassemble the bracelet to see the reference number. So guys, just to finish off, let's touch on the value proposition. So we've looked at the details within each watch, and we know therefore that there's going to be a big impact on the pricing. This 16610 here we see is priced at £8,499. It's available at Xupes.com now. The Kermit is priced at £13,499, and while that's a significant uptake on this predecessor, you can see the differences from a design perspective. Because of the limited period of run, we know that it's a solid investment for the future. So this 1680 is priced at $11,999, and one thing we have seen a trend for over the years is a real uptick in interest in these early references from Rolex. While it sits somewhere in between these two references price-wise, it also reflects the entry into Rolex vintage sports models. So to conclude, Thank you for joining me. I do hope you've picked up a few nuggets of wisdom there. We've picked 3 subs that we feel reflect different collectors, different buyers, from newer references to old, limited edition, maxi dials to tritium dials, to sapphire crystal versus box plexiglass. And as always, do let me know in the comments below what you think. Please do not hesitate to click subscribe. It's always lovely to have you with us. And until next time, goodbye.